The wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like whispered secrets, bending their branches until they scratched against the windows of the old farmhouse. The property sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through the hills of rural Oregon, where the valleys turned gold in autumn, and the air smelled of rain even when the sky was clear. For 60 years, this place had belonged to Margaret Cole, a woman the townspeople remembered as kind but intensely private, the sort who smiled at neighbors but never invited them past the front porch. Now, standing in the overgrown yard with the wind tugging at her jacket, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Sarah Mitchell felt the weight of that privacy pressing against her. She was Margaret's only grandchild, the one who had visited most often as a child, who had sat at her grandmother's kitchen table, eating warm bread, while listening to stories that always seemed to stop just before they revealed anything important. Margaret had passed 3 weeks ago, quietly in her sleep, leaving behind a house full of questions and a shed that no one had been allowed to enter for as long as anyone could remember. Sarah's mother, Claire, arrived in a separate car, her face tight with the practiced indifference she wore whenever discussing her own mother. Behind her came Sarah's uncle Robert and his wife Linda, both already complaining about the long drive and the waste of time this would surely be. They had come not out of love, but obligation mixed with the faint hope that something of value might be hidden in the cluttered rooms. The house stood exactly as Sarah remembered it, painted white but graying with age, its porch sagging slightly on one side, the flower boxes empty now except for dried stems. When she pushed open the front door, the smell hit her immediately. Lavender and old paper, dust, and the faint sweetness of the apple pies her grandmother used to bake every Sunday. Time had frozen here. The furniture sat draped in sheets. The clock above the mantel had stopped at exactly 3:17. Photographs lined the walls, their frames thick with dust, showing a younger Margaret smiling in front of landscapes Sarah didn't recognize. Her mother sighed heavily as she surveyed the rooms. She never threw anything away. This is going to take forever. Robert wandered toward the kitchen, opening cabinets and drawers with little ceremony. Probably nothing worth keeping. We should just call an estate sale company and be done with it. Sarah said nothing. She moved through the house slowly, her fingers trailing along surfaces, touching the spines of books her grandmother had read, the porcelain figurines on the shelf, the Afghan folded neatly on the back of the rocking chair. In the bedroom, she found Margaret's reading glasses still resting on the nightstand beside a Bible with pages worn soft from use. But it was the window that drew her attention, the one that looked out over the backyard to where the shed stood. It was larger than she remembered, built from dark wood that had weathered but never rotted, its roof intact while the barn nearby had long since collapsed into ruin. A heavy padlock secured the door, and even from this distance, Sarah could see the chain wrapped tight around the handles. She had asked about it once when she was maybe 7 or 8, her curiosity sparked by the mystery of a building she was forbidden to approach. Her grandmother had smiled that gentle smile that revealed nothing, and said softly, "That's not a place for children, dear. Some things need to stay private." The tone had been kind but absolute, carrying a weight that made Sarah never ask again. Still, she had wondered. On summer visits, she would watch from the window as her grandmother crossed the yard early in the morning or late at night, always alone, always locking the door carefully behind her. Sometimes Margaret would be inside for hours, other times only minutes, but she never explained, and no one else ever asked. Now, standing in that same bedroom with the afternoon light slanting through the dusty glass, Sarah felt the old curiosity rise again, sharper and more urgent. What had her grandmother guarded so fiercely? Why had she spent so many hours in that shed, moving in and out like it held something sacred? Downstairs, her family was already arguing about what to keep and what to sell. Her mother wanted the china. Robert was eyeing the furniture. Linda complained that nothing was worth the trouble. Their voices drifted up through the floorboards, sharp and impatient, stripping the house of its dignity with every word. Sarah closed the bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about Margaret in her final days, how small she had seemed in the hospital bed, her hands thin and cold. Sarah had held them, whispering that she loved her, and Margaret had squeezed back with surprising strength, her eyes bright despite her failing body. "Promise me something," her grandmother had whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't let them throw it all away. Not without looking first." Sarah had promised, though she hadn't understood what her grandmother meant. Now, looking out at the shed, she wondered if this was it. That evening, as the others prepared to leave and return in the morning, Sarah announced she would stay the night. Her mother frowned. "Here? Alone? It's drafty and probably full of mice." "I'll be fine," Sarah said firmly. "Someone should stay with the house." Robert shrugged, clearly relieved not to have to deal with it himself. "Suit yourself. We'll be back tomorrow to start sorting things out properly." When their taillights disappeared down the gravel road, the silence settled over the property like a blanket. Sarah stood on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky, and felt the weight of solitude wrap around her. The shed loomed at the edge of the yard, a dark shape against the darker trees. She could almost feel it watching her, waiting. She went inside and made herself tea in her grandmother's kitchen, using the same kettle Margaret had used, the same chipped mug. The house creaked around her, the sounds familiar but strange in the emptiness. She found herself walking from room to room, touching things, trying to feel her grandmother's presence in the objects she had left behind. In the study, she discovered a small wooden box on the desk. Inside were keys, dozens of them, labeled with tags in her grandmother's careful handwriting: basement, attic, garden shed. And then, at the bottom, a single brass key on a leather cord, labeled simply, "Mine." Sarah's breath caught. She held the key up to the lamplight, turning it slowly. It was older than the others, heavier, its teeth worn smooth from years of use. This was it, the key to the shed. She could feel the certainty settling in her chest like a stone. But she didn't go outside. Not yet. Something held her back, a sense that once she opened that door, everything would change. So she sat in her grandmother's chair, the key resting in her palm, and waited for morning. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of her grandmother walking across the yard in the moonlight, the shed door standing open, light spilling out into the darkness. When Sarah woke, dawn was breaking pale and cold through the windows. She rose stiffly, her body aching from the uncomfortable chair, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. Her hands shook slightly as she poured the water, as she watched it drip slowly into the pot. She was afraid, she realized, afraid of what she might find, afraid of disappointment, afraid that the mystery she had carried all these years would collapse into something ordinary and sad. But she had made a promise, and she would keep it. She pulled on her jacket and stepped outside. The morning air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. The grass was heavy with dew, soaking through her shoes as she walked across the yard. The shed stood exactly as it had the night before, solid and silent, its padlock gleaming faintly in the early light. Sarah stopped a few feet away, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She reached into her pocket and drew out the brass key, feeling its weight, its history. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she stepped forward, slid the key into the padlock, and turned. The lock opened with a soft click that seemed too loud in the stillness. She unwrapped the chain slowly, letting it fall to the ground with a heavy clink. The door handle was cold under her palm. She pulled, and the hinges groaned as the door swung inward. Light fell across the threshold, spreading slowly into the darkness within. And as Sarah stepped inside, "If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Her breath caught in her throat at what lay before her. The interior of the shed was not what she had expected. There was no clutter, no rusted tools or forgotten junk. Instead, everything was meticulously organized, clean, and purposeful. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, dry and well kept despite the years. Along both walls stretched floor-to-ceiling shelving, every inch filled with identical wooden boxes, each one labeled with dates spanning 6 decades. The labels were written in her grandmother's precise handwriting, starting with 1963 and continuing all the way to this year. In the center of the room stood a simple wooden table with a single chair, its surface bare, except for a leather journal, an old fountain pen, and a lamp with a green glass shade. The floor beneath her feet was swept clean, the boards polished smooth from years of footsteps. A small window on the far wall let in a shaft of morning light that fell directly across the table like a spotlight. Sarah moved forward slowly, her footsteps echoing in the quiet space. She felt as though she had entered a library or archive, something sacred and intentional. Her eyes moved along the rows of boxes, reading the dates, trying to comprehend the scope of what her grandmother had been doing here. Every year was represented, some years taking up multiple boxes. The organization was perfect, each container aligned precisely, each label facing forward. She approached the nearest shelf and carefully lifted down a box marked 1965. Setting it on the table, she opened the lid with trembling hands. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, each in its own envelope, tied together in neat bundles with twine. She picked up the first bundle and untied it carefully. The envelopes were addressed to different people, names Sarah didn't recognize, written in her grandmother's flowing script. She opened one at random. The letter inside was dated March 12, 1965. "Dear Helen," it began, "I heard about your loss and wanted you to know that you are in my thoughts. I remember your daughter's smile. She had a light in her that will never truly be gone. I've enclosed something I thought you might want to have." Folded beneath the letter was a small black and white photograph of a young girl standing in front of a school, her face bright with joy. Sarah's throat tightened. She carefully replaced the letter and opened another. "Dear Thomas," this one read, "The war took much from you, but it did not take your dignity. You are remembered. You matter. I've included the medals you thought were lost." The envelope was thicker, and when Sarah looked inside, she found military medals wrapped carefully in tissue paper. She moved through bundle after bundle, letter after letter, each one a small act of kindness, reaching across time. Some were letters of condolence, others offered encouragement, or included lost items, photographs, documents, small mementos that her grandmother had somehow recovered and returned. Each letter was personal, specific, written with care to someone who needed to know they had not been forgotten. Sarah's hands shook as she tied the bundle back together and returned it to the box. She lifted down another container, this one from 1972. Inside were more letters, but also newspaper clippings carefully preserved, obituaries, birth announcements, wedding notices. Her grandmother had been documenting lives, tracking the stories of people in their community and beyond, ensuring that nothing was lost to time. Box after box revealed the same pattern. Letters written to the grieving, the lonely, the forgotten. Photographs returned to families who had lost them. Documents preserved for those who had no one else to remember. It was a lifetime of quiet service, done in secret, asking nothing in return. Sarah sank into the chair, overwhelmed. She thought of her grandmother sitting here year after year, writing these letters by lamplight, tracking these lives, carrying the weight of other people's memories. How had she found them all? How had she known what they needed? She reached for the leather journal on the table and opened it carefully. The first entry was dated January 1963. "Today I begin what I feel called to do," her grandmother had written in her careful hand. "There are too many people whose stories end in silence. Too many who leave this world with no one to remember them. I cannot change what happens to us all in the end, but I can make sure that while we are here, we are seen, we are acknowledged, we matter." Sarah read page after page, years of entries documenting her grandmother's mission. Margaret had started small, writing letters to families who had lost loved ones, including photographs she had taken at community events or found in old albums at estate sales. She reached out to veterans who had returned home broken, to widows left alone, to children who had aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. She became a silent guardian of memory, the keeper of stories that would otherwise be lost. The journal revealed a network of connections that spanned the entire region. Margaret had corresponded with funeral homes, hospitals, churches, libraries, anyone who might know of someone in need of remembrance. She had spent her modest savings on postage, on frames for photographs, on small gifts to include with her letters. She had given everything to this work, asking nothing for herself. Sarah's vision blurred with tears as she read her grandmother's words. "I do this not for recognition," Margaret had written, "but because I believe that love is remembering. When we forget each other, we lose what makes us human. And so I will remember. I will write. I will preserve, even if no one ever knows." But people had known. Sarah found that out when she discovered a smaller box tucked beneath the table. Inside were responses, letters written back to her grandmother over the years. "Thank you for remembering my son. You will never know what your words meant to me. I had no one left who spoke his name. You gave him back to me." Another read, "The photograph you sent was the only one I had lost in the fire. How did you find it? How did you know? You are an angel." Letter after letter expressed gratitude, wonder, sometimes disbelief that anyone would care enough to reach out. Many were from people who had been completely alone, who had thought themselves forgotten by the world. Margaret's letters had reached them like lifelines, proving that someone still saw them, still held their stories sacred. Sarah sat in the shed for hours, reading through the boxes, piecing together the scope of her grandmother's secret life. It was staggering. Thousands of letters written over 6 decades, thousands of lives touched, remembered, honored, and all of it done in silence, hidden away in this shed where no one was allowed to look. Now Sarah understood why. Her grandmother had known that if her family found out, they would have stopped her. They would have called it a waste of time and money. They would have mocked her for caring about strangers. So she had built this sanctuary in secret, a place where her true work could continue undisturbed. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Sarah discovered something else. In the most recent boxes, the letters were unfinished. Her grandmother's handwriting had grown shakier, the entries in her journal shorter and more strained. "I am running out of time," one entry read. "My body fails me. But there are still so many names, so many stories that need to be preserved. I have done what I can, but I fear it will not be enough." On the final page of the journal, dated just 2 months before her death, Margaret had written a single sentence: "If you are reading this, please do not let my work die with me." Sarah closed the journal and pressed it against her chest, tears streaming down her face. She thought of her family downstairs yesterday, arguing over china and furniture, dismissing her grandmother's life as small and unremarkable. They had no idea of the magnitude of what Margaret had built, of the countless lives she had touched, of the legacy she had left on behind. Sarah wiped her eyes and stood, looking around the shed with new understanding. This was not a place of secrets. It was a place of love. A cathedral built from paper and ink, from memory and devotion, and her grandmother had entrusted it to her. She spent the rest of the day going through more boxes, trying to grasp the full scope of the work. She found records meticulously kept, lists of names and addresses, notes about families and their stories. Her grandmother had been a historian of the forgotten, an archivist of the overlooked. One box contained correspondence with a local funeral director who had quietly passed along information about families who seemed to have no one attending services. Another held notes from a social worker who had connected Margaret with foster children aging out of the system. There were photographs by the hundreds, some professionally taken, others simple snapshots that Margaret had collected over the years. Each one was labeled with names, dates, and brief notes about the people pictured. Sarah found images of families at picnics, soldiers in uniform, children at school, elderly couples on their porches. Every photograph represented a life, a moment, a memory that Margaret had deemed worth preserving. In one box, Sarah discovered something that made her pause. It was a bundle of letters her grandmother had written but never sent. They were addressed to Claire and Robert, Sarah's mother and uncle, dated throughout the years. Sarah hesitated before opening the first one, feeling as though she was intruding on something intensely private. But curiosity overcame her reluctance. "My dear Claire," the letter began, "I know you don't understand why I spend so much time alone. You think I'm wasting my life, hiding from the world. But I want you to know that I am not hiding. I am remembering. I am holding space for those who have no one else. I wish I could make you see that this matters, that these forgotten people matter. But I understand that you have your own life, your own concerns. I only hope that someday you will understand what I was trying to do." The letter was tender but sad, revealing the gulf that had existed between Margaret and her daughter. Sarah found similar letters written to Robert, equally loving but tinged with resignation. Her grandmother had known that her family would never approve of her work, so she had kept it hidden, carrying the burden of their judgment, along with the weight of all those stories. Sarah carefully returned the letters to their box, her heart aching for her grandmother's loneliness. Margaret had spent 60 years in this shed, giving everything to strangers while her own family remained distant and dismissive. Yet she had never stopped. She had continued writing, remembering, preserving, even as her body failed and her family turned away. By the time the sun began to set, Sarah had made her decision. When her family returned the next morning, she would not tell them about the shed. Not yet. They would not understand. They would want to sell everything, to clear it out and move on. But Sarah would protect it, just as her grandmother had protected it. She would find a way to continue the work, to honor the mission Margaret had given her life to. That night, she returned to the house and sat at her grandmother's desk. She took out a piece of paper and began to write, her hand shaking but her resolve firm. "Dear grandmother," she wrote, "I found your shed. I found your letters. I found your life's work. And I promise you, I will not let it die. I will carry it forward. I will remember." Over the following days, Sarah's family returned and began the process of sorting through the house. They took what they wanted and dismissed the rest. They never asked about the shed, assuming it contained nothing of value. Sarah let them believe that. She kept the brass key in her pocket at all times, and whenever she could slip away, she returned to the shed to continue reading, to learn more about the people her grandmother had helped. She began making her own lists, her own plans. She contacted some of the families mentioned in the letters, carefully reaching out to let them know that Margaret's work was being preserved. The responses overwhelmed her. Many had never forgotten the letters they had received decades ago. They wept when they learned that someone was continuing Margaret's mission. One afternoon, while Sarah was in the shed organizing boxes, she heard a car pull up outside. Through the window, she saw an elderly woman stepping out, moving slowly with the help of a cane. Sarah went to meet her, curious and slightly apprehensive. The woman smiled when she saw her, tears already forming in her eyes. "Are you Margaret's granddaughter?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sarah nodded, and the woman reached out to take her hand. "I'm Dorothy Henderson. Your grandmother wrote to me in 1978, after my husband was killed in an accident. I had 3 small children and no family to help. I was ready to give up. But her letter, it came with a photograph of my husband that I thought I'd lost, and words that gave me strength. She told me I was stronger than I knew, that my children needed me. That letter saved my life." Sarah felt her own eyes fill with tears. "Would you like to come inside?" she asked gently, gesturing toward the shed. Dorothy's face lit up with wonder. "Inside? I never thought I'd be allowed." Together they walked across the yard, and Sarah unlocked the door. When Dorothy stepped inside and saw the rows of boxes, the carefully preserved letters, the journal lying open on the table, she stopped and pressed her hand to her mouth. "This is where she did it," she whispered. "This is where she remembered us all." Sarah showed her the box from 1978 and found the carbon copy of the letter Margaret had sent. Dorothy read it with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. "She kept a copy," Dorothy said in amazement. "She kept a record of everyone she helped." That afternoon marked a turning point. Sarah realized that the shed needed to be more than just her private project. These stories belonged to the people who had been touched by Margaret's kindness. They deserved to know, to come together, to honor the woman who had remembered them. Over the next few weeks, Sarah began reaching out more deliberately. She contacted local newspapers with a brief story about her grandmother's secret mission. She reached out to community centers and churches, asking if anyone remembered receiving letters from Margaret Cole. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, her phone was ringing constantly. People from across the state and beyond called to share their stories. Many wanted to visit the shed, to see where Margaret had worked, to pay their respects. But Sarah's family was a different story. When her mother found out what she was planning, the reaction was explosive. Claire arrived at the property one morning, her face red with anger. "You're telling people to come here?" she demanded. "You're making a spectacle of Mother's eccentricity?" "This is embarrassing, Sarah." She was a lonely old woman who wasted her life writing to strangers. "Let it go." Sarah felt something harden inside her. "She's not a spectacle," she said quietly but firmly, "and she didn't waste her life. She spent it giving hope to people who had none. She remembered people everyone else forgot." "That's not embarrassing. That's extraordinary." Her mother's face twisted. "You sound just like her, always defending her strange behavior. Well, I'm telling you now, this ends. We're selling this property, and that includes the shed. Everything in it goes." "No," Sarah said, the word coming out sharp and absolute. "The shed and the land are mine. Grandmother left them to me specifically. You can sell the house, but you can't touch the shed." Her mother stared at her, shocked by her defiance. Then she turned and left without another word. But Sarah knew the battle wasn't over. Robert called that evening, his voice cold and calculating. He suggested that she was being irrational, that she needed to think about the practical implications, that she couldn't possibly maintain a shed full of old letters. He talked about property values and estate taxes and responsibilities. Sarah listened to him for 5 minutes, then interrupted. "Uncle Robert," she said calmly, "I'm going to honor grandmother's work. If that doesn't make sense to you, I'm sorry, but this is happening." When she hung up, her hands were shaking, but she felt stronger than she had in years. She had drawn a line, and she would not cross back. As word continued to spread, more people came forward. A man in his 60s drove from Seattle to tell Sarah how Margaret's letter had reached him in prison, reminding him that he had a family who still loved him. A woman brought her teenage daughter to show her the photograph of her grandmother that Margaret had preserved and sent, when no one else had pictures. A group of veterans came together, all of them having received letters from Margaret after they returned from Vietnam. all of them crediting her words with helping them survive their darkest days. Sarah began to document these testimonies, recording them on her phone, writing down their stories. She realized that Margaret's work had created a web of connection far larger than anyone had imagined. These weren't just isolated acts of kindness. They were threads woven through entire communities, holding people together in ways they had never fully understood. One evening, as Sarah sat in the shed surrounded by the evidence of her grandmother's life, she heard a soft knock on the door. She opened it to find a young woman standing there, maybe in her late 20s, holding a worn envelope. "I don't know if you remember me," the woman said hesitantly. "I came to the gathering last month. I'm the one whose mother died when she was in foster care." Sarah remembered immediately. "Yes, of course. Please, come in." The woman stepped inside and looked around, her eyes taking in the boxes, the table, the lamp. "This place," she said softly. "It feels sacred." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The woman held out the envelope she'd been carrying. "Your grandmother wrote this to me when I was 16. I've read it so many times that the paper is starting to fall apart. I wanted you to have it, to add it to the collection. Maybe someone else needs to know that there are people like your grandmother in the world." Sarah took the letter carefully and read it. The words were simple but powerful, telling a frightened teenage girl that she had value, that her life mattered, that there were people in the world who cared, even if they had never met. Margaret had included a small amount of money with instructions that it was to be used for something the girl needed, not for anyone else. And she had enclosed that precious photograph. "I used that money to buy my first job interview outfit," the woman said, her voice breaking. "I got the job. It was the first time anyone had invested in me like that. It changed everything." Sarah hugged her, both of them crying. When they separated, Sarah said, "Your story needs to be part of this. All of these stories need to be told." That night, Sarah sat down and began writing a proposal. She would turn the shed into a permanent memorial and archive, a place where Margaret's work could be preserved and continued. She would seek non-profit status, find funding, create a structure that would outlast her own lifetime. It was ambitious, maybe impossible, but she had seen what her grandmother had accomplished with nothing but determination and love. If Margaret could spend 60 years writing letters in secret, Sarah could find a way to bring that work into the light. The proposal took weeks to write. Sarah reached out to historians, archivists, non-profit consultants. She contacted the local historical society and the state archives. She applied for grants and drafted bylaws. Every spare moment was spent planning, organizing, building the foundation for what would become the Margaret Cole Memorial Project. Her family's opposition intensified. Her mother threatened legal action, claiming that Sarah was squandering the estate. Robert sent angry emails accusing her of being selfish and irrational. But Sarah pressed forward, supported by the growing community of people who understood what Margaret's work meant. A local lawyer, who had received one of Margaret's letters as a child, offered to help pro bono. A retired librarian volunteered to catalogue the collection. A grant writer whose father had been helped by Margaret donated her services. Slowly, piece by piece, the project took shape. The shed was officially designated as a historical archive. The boxes were carefully catalogued and preserved. A small non-profit was established, with Sarah as its director. And the story began to spread even further, reaching newspapers and radio stations, even catching the attention of a documentary filmmaker. 6 months after Sarah had first opened the shed door, she stood before a gathering of more than 100 people who had come to the official dedication of the Margaret Cole Memorial Project. They stood in the yard where Margaret had walked for 60 years, where she had carried her secret mission with quiet dignity. Sarah spoke about her grandmother's life, about the thousands of letters she had written, about the forgotten people she had remembered. She spoke about love as action, about kindness as practice, about the power of one person to change countless lives. When she finished, there was a long moment of silence. Then, one by one, people came forward. They placed flowers by the shed door. They shared their stories aloud, telling of letters received, photographs returned, hope restored. They wept and laughed and embraced each other. These strangers, connected by the thread of Margaret's love. An elderly man stepped forward, his hands shaking as he held up a faded envelope. "Your grandmother wrote to me in 1969, he said, his voice barely audible. "I was 19 years old and had just lost my best friend in Vietnam. I came home broken, angry, wanting to die. Her letter told me that my friend's life had mattered, that my grief was proof of love, and that I had to keep living to honor that love. I'm 84 years old now. I've had a good life, a family, a career, and it all started because a woman I never met cared enough to write me a letter." The crowd stood silent, many of them crying openly. Sarah felt her grandmother's presence so strongly in that moment that she could almost see her standing at the edge of the gathering, smiling that quiet smile, her eyes bright with tears. The dedication ceremony lasted for hours. People toured the shed in small groups, handling the boxes and with reverence, reading entries from Margaret's journal, seeing the scope of what she had accomplished. Many left donations. Others signed up to volunteer. Some asked how they could start similar projects in their own communities. As the sun set and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah stood alone in the shed, exhausted but deeply fulfilled. She looked around at the boxes lining the walls, at the table where her grandmother had sat for so many years, at the lamp casting its warm glow across the room. She understood now why Margaret had kept this place locked, not because she was ashamed, but because she was protecting something sacred. She was guarding it until the right person came along, someone who would understand its value and carry it forward. Sarah had been that person, and she would not fail her grandmother's trust. In the months that followed, the memorial project grew. The shed became a destination for those seeking to understand how one person could make a difference. Schools brought students to learn about Margaret's work. Churches incorporated her story into their teachings about service and compassion. Grief support groups visited to find comfort in the evidence that remembering mattered. Sarah continued to write letters herself, following her grandmother's example. She reached out to families who had lost loved ones, to veterans struggling with PTSD, to foster children aging out of the system. She included photographs when she could find them, wrote words of encouragement and recognition, ensured that each person knew they were seen. The work was endless, but it was also deeply meaningful. Every letter she wrote felt like a conversation with her grandmother, like carrying forward a sacred duty. She began training volunteers, teaching them how to research families, how to write with compassion, how to preserve memories with care. One afternoon, almost a year after she had first opened the shed, Sarah received a call from an unexpected source. It was her mother. They had not spoken in months, the rift between them still raw and unhealed. "Mom?" Sarah said cautiously. There was a long pause. Then her mother's voice came through, smaller and more uncertain than Sarah had ever heard it. "I need to tell you something," Claire said. "I went to the dedication ceremony. I stayed in the back where you couldn't see me. I heard those people talk about what your grandmother did for them." Sarah felt her heart beat faster but said nothing, letting her mother continue. "I never knew," Claire said, her voice breaking. "I never understood. I thought she was wasting her time. I thought she cared more about strangers than about us. But she was doing something important, wasn't she? She was saving people." Sarah closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "She was." "I'm sorry," her mother said. "I'm sorry I never saw it. I'm sorry I tried to stop you. You were right to protect it." Sarah didn't know what to say. The apology felt too small for the years of dismissal, the mockery, the judgment. But it was something. It was a beginning. "Would you like to come see the shed?" Sarah asked gently. "Really see it?" There was another pause. Then, quietly, "Yes, I think I would." When her mother arrived a few days later, Sarah met her at the door and handed her the brass key. "You open it," she said. Claire took the key with trembling hands and walked slowly across the yard. She unlocked the padlock and pushed open the door, stepping into the space where her mother had spent so much of her life. She stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking in the boxes, the table, the journal, the lamp. "She was here," Claire whispered. "All those years when I thought she was avoiding us, she was here, doing this." Sarah nodded, standing beside her mother in the doorway. "She chose this," she said gently. "She chose to remember people who had no one else." Her mother reached out and touched one of the boxes, her fingers tracing the date written in Margaret's careful hand. "I didn't know her at all, did I?" she said, more to herself than to Sarah. "Maybe you can start to know her now," Sarah replied. Over the following hour, Sarah showed her mother through the collection. She read her some of the letters Margaret had written, showed her the responses, explained the network of kindness her grandmother had built. Claire listened in silence, her face changing as understanding dawned. When they reached the box containing the unsent letters Margaret had written to her own children, Sarah hesitated. Then she carefully lifted it out and handed it to her mother. "She wrote to you," Sarah said quietly. "She just never sent them." Claire opened the box and pulled out the first letter. As she read, her face crumpled. By the time she finished the third letter, she was sobbing, clutching the pages to her chest. "She loved us," Claire gasped. "Even when we were terrible to her, she loved us. She understood us. Why didn't she send these?" Sarah touched her mother's shoulder gently. "I think she didn't want to guilt you. She didn't want to make you feel obligated. She just wanted you to be happy, even if that meant being separate from her." The two women sat together in Margaret's shed, surrounded by decades of love preserved in paper and ink. They cried together for the first time in years, grieving not just Margaret's death, but the relationship they had failed to build while she was alive. Before they left, Claire turned to Sarah with red-rimmed eyes. "Teach me," she said. "Teach me how to do what she did. I want to help. I want to write letters. I want to remember people like she did. It won't bring her back, but maybe it will help me understand her." Sarah felt something tight in her chest finally loosen. "Okay," she said. "We'll do it together." And so Claire became a volunteer at the memorial project, coming every week to help catalogue letters, to learn about the people Margaret had helped, to write new letters under Sarah's guidance. Robert never apologized. He never visited the shed, but Sarah made peace with that. Not everyone would understand. Not everyone could see the value in what Margaret had built. That was okay. There were enough people who did understand, enough people who recognized that love and memory were worth preserving. Years passed. The Margaret Cole Memorial Project continued to grow. It expanded to help train similar initiatives in other communities. Sarah published a book about her grandmother's work, sharing the story with a wider audience. The shed itself became a pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand how ordinary people could do extraordinary things. Sarah never left. She made the property her permanent home, living in the renovated farmhouse and spending her days in the shed, continuing the work her grandmother had started. She grew old there, just as Margaret had, sitting at that same table, writing letters by lamplight, remembering those who might otherwise be forgotten. When Sarah was in her 70s, a young woman came to volunteer at the project. Her name was Emma, and she was Sarah's grandniece, the daughter of Claire's son. Emma had grown up hearing stories about Margaret, about the shed, about the letters that had changed lives. She had always wanted to be part of it. Sarah saw in Emma the same quality she had seen in herself all those years ago, the same capacity for devotion, the same understanding that remembering was a sacred act. And she knew that when her own time came, The work would continue. The shed would endure. The letters would keep being written. The forgotten would be remembered. One evening, as Emma sat beside her at the table, helping to catalogue a new donation of photographs, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. This is what legacy means, she thought. Not buildings or money or fame, but this, the continuation of love across generations, the commitment to seeing each other, to remembering each other, to holding each other's stories sacred. She thought of her grandmother, of Margaret sitting in this same spot 60 years ago, beginning the work that would ripple forward through time. She thought of all the lives that had been touched, all the people who had been seen and valued, because one woman refused to let them be forgotten. And she understood, finally and completely, that this was enough. This was everything. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees, just as it always had. The property looked much as it had when Margaret was alive, though better maintained now, cared for by people who understood its significance. The shed stood solid and strong, its light glowing warm in the gathering darkness. Inside, two women sat side by side, surrounded by boxes of stories, continuing the work that would never truly end. Writing letters, preserving memories, remembering those who needed to be remembered. And somewhere, in the space between words and the silence between heartbeats, Margaret Cole smiled. Her work lived on. Her love continued. Her mission had been passed to hands that would hold it gently and carry it forward. The shed that had been locked for so long was now open, its doors welcoming anyone who understood that we save each other through remembering, that we honor each other through witness, that we love each other through the simple act of refusing to forget. This was the secret of the shed. Not that it held treasure, but that it was treasure. Every box, every letter, every name carefully preserved, every story held sacred. This was what mattered. This was what endured. This was what it meant to live a life of meaning. And as the night deepened and the stars emerged above the Oregon hills, the light in the shed continued to burn, a beacon of remembrance, a testament to love, a promise that no one who had been seen by Margaret Cole would ever truly be forgotten. Her legacy was not measured in years or in dollars. It was measured in lives, in the veteran who lived because she reminded him he mattered, in the widow who found strength because she was remembered, in the foster child who persevered because someone told her she had value, in the hundreds, the thousands, the countless souls who had been touched by the quiet devotion of a woman who spent 60 years writing letters in a locked shed at the end of a gravel road. That was the treasure. That was the inheritance. That was what Sarah had found when she finally opened the door. And that was what she would spend the rest of her life protecting, expanding, and passing forward, until the day came when she too would be remembered, when her own story would be added to the collection, when another hand would pick up the pen and continue the work that love began. The shed stood waiting. The letters were ready. The mission continued. And in that continuation, Margaret Cole lived forever. The documentary filmmaker arrived on a crisp October morning, exactly 3 years after Sarah had first opened the shed. His name was David Chen, and he had heard about Margaret's story through a friend whose aunt had been one of the letter recipients. He came with a small crew, a camera operator and a sound technician, both of whom moved quietly and respectfully around the property, as though they understood they were walking on sacred ground. Sarah met them at the door, uncertain about allowing cameras into the space that had remained so private for so long. But David's approach was gentle, thoughtful. He didn't want to sensationalize Margaret's work. He wanted to understand it, to document it before the people who had known her were gone. "I've been making documentaries for 20 years, he told Sarah as they stood in the yard looking at the shed. "I've filmed wars and disasters, celebrities and politicians. But this story, what your grandmother did, this is the most important thing I've ever heard. These are the stories that actually matter. Sarah showed him through the shed slowly, explaining the organization system, the different types of letters, the responses Margaret had received. David listened intently, occasionally asking questions, his eyes growing wider as he began to grasp the full scope of what Margaret had accomplished. "How many letters?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah had done the count several times. Including the responses she received and the carbon copies she kept, we estimate somewhere between 15 and 20,000. Over 60 years. David sat down heavily in Margaret's chair. Overwhelmed. "That's not just dedication," he said quietly. "That's a life lived entirely in service to others." The filming took place over several months. David interviewed dozens of people who had received Margaret's letters or been touched by her work. He filmed the shed from every angle, capturing the morning light falling through the window, the neat rows of boxes, the worn surface of the table where Margaret had worked. He recorded Sarah, writing letters, following her grandmother's example, her hand moving across the page with the same careful deliberation. One of the most powerful interviews was with a man named James Blackwell, who had received a letter from Margaret in 1982. James was in his late 60s now, a successful architect, but he had once been a troubled teenager whose father had died in a factory accident. The insurance company had denied the claim, leaving his family destitute. James had been angry, violent, headed toward a life of crime. Then Margaret's letter arrived. She had somehow learned about his father's death, had researched the accident, and had included in her letter a copy of a document proving that the company had been at fault. "She gave me ammunition to fight back legally," James told the camera, his voice thick with emotion. "But more than that, she told me that my anger was justified, but didn't have to destroy me. She said, my father would want me to build things, not tear them down." That letter changed everything. "I went back to school. I became an architect because of what she said. Every building I design, I think of her. I think of my father. I build things that last." David filmed James standing in front of one of his buildings, a community center he had designed in his father's memory, and the footage was so powerful that Sarah wept when she saw it. This was what Margaret had done. She hadn't just written comforting words. She had given people tools to transform their lives, to build meaning from tragedy, to create beauty from pain. Another interview featured a woman named Patricia, who had aged out of foster care at 18 with nowhere to go. Margaret had found her somehow, had written to her regularly for 3 years, had sent small amounts of money and encouragement. Patricia was now a social worker herself, dedicated to helping other foster children navigate the system. "Your grandmother taught me that family isn't just blood," Patricia said, tears streaming down her face. "Family is anyone who sees you, who remembers you, who tells you that you matter. She was my family when I had no one else." The documentary took a year to complete. David worked with editors and composers, crafting a film that honored Margaret's work without exploiting it. When he finally showed Sarah the rough cut, she sat in the dark of his editing studio and watched 60 years of her grandmother's life unfold on screen. She saw Margaret's photograph from her younger days, heard her story told through the voices of those she had helped, witnessed the impact of one woman's decision to remember the forgotten. The film ended with footage of Sarah in the shed, writing a letter by lamplight, her face peaceful and purposeful. The final words on screen were Margaret's own, taken from her journal. "Love is remembering. When we forget each other, we lose what makes us human. And so I will remember. I will write. I will preserve, even if no one ever knows." But now everyone would know. The documentary premiered at a small film festival in Portland and won the Audience Award. Then it was picked up by a streaming service and released nationally. Within weeks, millions of people had watched it. The response was overwhelming. Sarah's phone rang constantly with calls from journalists, from people who wanted to donate, from communities asking how they could start similar projects. Letters poured into the memorial project, some containing donations, others simply expressing gratitude for Margaret's example. "I've been so focused on my career that I forgot what matters," one letter read. "Your grandmother reminded me. I'm going to start volunteering at a nursing home, writing down the life stories of residents who have no family. Thank you for sharing her with the world." Another letter came from a teacher who had shown the documentary to her students. "They were so moved that we started a class project," she wrote. "Each student has adopted someone in our community who might feel forgotten. They interview them, write their stories, create memory books. It's the most meaningful work we've done all year." Margaret's mission was multiplying, spreading across the country like ripples expanding from a stone thrown into still water. Sarah could hardly keep up with the requests for information, for guidance, for blessing to start similar projects. She hired staff to help manage the memorial project, but she insisted on personally reviewing every letter that came in, just as her grandmother had done. One letter in particular struck her. It came from a prison in Colorado, written in careful block letters by an inmate serving a life sentence. "I saw the documentary in our common room," he wrote. "I've done terrible things. I hurt people. I deserve to be here. But watching your grandmother's story made me realize that even I can do something meaningful with the time I have left. I've started writing letters to other inmates who have no family, who get no mail. I tell them they're not forgotten. I remind them they're human. It's not much, but it's something. Your grandmother taught me that even the smallest act of remembering matters." Sarah wrote back immediately, encouraging him, sending him stamps and paper, connecting him with a prison ministry that could support his work. She thought of her grandmother's belief that every life had value, that everyone deserved to be remembered, and felt certain that Margaret would have approved. The documentary's success brought challenges too. Some people wanted to commercialize Margaret's story, to turn it into a brand or a movement with logos and merchandise. Sarah firmly refused. "This isn't a product," she told anyone who asked. "It's a practice. It's a way of living. You can't buy it or sell it. You can only do it." She established clear guidelines for any group wanting to use Margaret's name or model. The work had to be done without expectation of recognition. It had to focus on those who were truly forgotten, not on gaining attention for the volunteers. It had to be about remembering, not about being remembered. Some people understood and honored these principles. Others didn't, and Sarah had to distance the memorial project from efforts that missed the point. It was exhausting work, protecting her grandmother's legacy from those who would distort it. But Sarah remained vigilant. Margaret had spent 60 years doing this work in secret, asking nothing in return. Sarah would not let that purity be corrupted now. 5 years after the documentary's release, Sarah received an invitation that surprised her. A major university wanted to establish a center for memory and remembrance studies, and they wanted to base it on Margaret's work. They offered to create an endowed chair in Margaret's name, to house the entire collection of letters in climate-controlled archives, to make it accessible to researchers and the public. At first, Sarah resisted. The shed was where the letters belonged, where Margaret had written them. But as she toured the proposed facility, she began to see the possibilities. The university could preserve the letters far better than she could. They could digitize everything, making it accessible to people around the world. They could study Margaret's methods, teach them to new generations, ensure that the work continued long after Sarah was gone. The negotiations took months. Sarah insisted on certain conditions. The shed itself would remain on the property as a historic site. A portion of the collection would always stay there, rotating periodically but maintaining the sacred space. The university would have to commit to continuing the letter-writing program, not just studying it academically, but practicing it. And most importantly, the focus would always remain on the forgotten people Margaret had helped, not on Margaret herself. She would hate being turned into a saint, Sarah told the university president. She was just a woman who decided that remembering mattered. That's the story that needs to be told. The Center for Memory and Remembrance Studies opened on what would have been Margaret's 100th birthday. Hundreds of people attended the dedication, including many now elderly individuals who had received Margaret's letters as children or young adults. The university president spoke about the importance of bearing witness, of holding each other's stories. Sarah spoke briefly, reading from her grandmother's journal, letting Margaret's own words explain her mission. But the most powerful moment came when the university unveiled a sculpture that would stand at the entrance to the center. It wasn't a statue of Margaret. Instead, it was a bronze representation of an envelope, slightly open, with light seeming to emanate from within. The plaque beneath it read simply, "Every letter is a life remembered. Every life remembered is a life honored." Sarah stood before it for a long time, tears streaming down her face, knowing her grandmother would have approved of being remembered not through her own image, but through the image of the work itself. That evening, back at the farmhouse, Sarah sat in the shed with Emma. Her grandniece was now in her 30s, married, with 2 small children who had learned to play quietly in the yard while their mother worked on the letters. "We did it," Emma said softly, looking around at the boxes, fewer now that many had been transferred to the university, but still present, still powerful. "We gave her work a future." Sarah nodded, but something was troubling her. She had been feeling tired lately, more than usual. Her doctor had found some concerning things in her recent tests. She hadn't told anyone yet, but she knew her time as keeper of the shed was coming to an end. "Emma," she said carefully, "there's something we need to talk about." Over the next hour, Sarah explained her health situation and what it meant. She talked about succession, about ensuring the memorial project would continue, about passing the brass key to the next keeper. Emma listened with tears in her eyes but without protest. She had known this day would come. She had been preparing for it, though she had hoped it would be many years away still. "I'm not afraid," Sarah said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I've done what Grandma asked. I didn't let her work die. And now it's bigger than either of us. It will go on." The 2 women sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind in the pines, the same wind Margaret had listened to for 60 years. Then Emma spoke. "Tell me the story again," she said. "Tell me how you first opened the door." And so Sarah told it, the way she had told it hundreds of times now, the way it had been captured in the documentary, the way it would be told long after she was gone. She spoke of finding the key, of her trembling hands, of the moment the door swung open, and she saw what her grandmother had built. She spoke of the transformation that had happened in her own heart, of learning what legacy truly meant, of understanding that love is not what we feel but what we do. As she talked, Emma listened with the attention of someone who knows she is receiving something precious, something she will have to pass on in turn. When Sarah finished, Emma reached across the table and took her hand. "I won't let it die either," she promised. "I'll protect it the way you protected it, the way she protected it." Sarah squeezed her hand, knowing it was true. The chain would hold. The work would continue. 6 months later, Sarah's health declined rapidly. She spent her final weeks not in a hospital, but in the farmhouse, with the shed visible through her bedroom window. People came to visit, to say goodbye, to thank her for everything she had done. Her mother Claire, now quite elderly herself, sat by her bedside for hours, holding her hand, finally having learned the language of quiet devotion that Margaret had spoken so fluently. On Sarah's last day, Emma brought the leather journal from the shed and placed it on the bed beside her. "Read to me," Sarah whispered. And Emma opened to a random page and read her grandmother's words aloud, words about remembering, about love, about the unbreakable threads that connect us all. Sarah died peacefully that evening, The journal still open beside her, the lamp from the shed casting its green-tinted light across the room. They buried her next to Margaret in the small cemetery at the edge of town. On her headstone, they engraved the same words that marked Margaret's grave. She remembered. The memorial project continued without missing a beat. Emma stepped into Sarah's role as if she had been born to it, which in a way, she had. The university center thrived, training new researchers, teaching new volunteers, expanding the reach of Margaret's mission. The documentary continued to find new audiences, inspiring new projects in communities around the world. But perhaps the most powerful continuation was the simplest. Every evening, just as the sun began to set, Emma would walk across the yard to the shed. She would unlock the door with the brass key that had now passed through 3 generations. She would sit at Margaret's table, turn on the green-shaded lamp, and write. Sometimes she wrote to people who had requested letters, who had heard about the project, and asked to be remembered. Sometimes she wrote to people she had found herself, reading obituaries and news stories, finding the forgotten in plain sight. And sometimes she simply wrote to add to the collection, to document the lives of people in her own community who deserved to have their stories preserved. Her children would sometimes join her, sitting quietly and learning. Her daughter, just 7 years old, had already begun asking questions about Margaret, about Sarah, about why remembering mattered. Emma answered patiently, knowing that one day, perhaps, the key would pass to another generation and the work would continue still. Years turned into decades. The world changed in countless ways, technology advancing, society shifting. But the fundamental human need to be seen, to be remembered, to matter, remained constant. And in a shed at the end of a gravel road in Oregon, the light continued to burn. Researchers came to study the thousands of letters, analyzing Margaret's techniques, her language, her methods of finding and helping the forgotten. They published papers and books, held conferences and workshops. But they always emphasized that the scholarship was secondary to the practice. Understanding how Margaret did it mattered less than actually doing it. The center became a pilgrimage site for people seeking to understand how one person could make such a profound difference. Visitors would tour the archives, read the letters, watch the documentary. Then, they would walk the path to the original shed, now preserved exactly as it had been, and sit in Margaret's chair. Many left transformed, carrying away not just inspiration but commitment. On the 50th anniversary of Margaret's death, the Memorial Project organized a global day of remembrance. People in dozens of countries committed to writing letters to someone forgotten in their own community. Over 10,000 letters were written that day, each one a continuation of what Margaret had started, a multiplication of her simple decision to remember. Emma, now in her 60s and training her own daughter to eventually take over the project, stood in the shed that evening surrounded by photographs of all the letter-writing events happening around the world. She thought of Margaret, who had done this work in absolute solitude, never knowing how far her influence would spread. She thought of Sarah, who had found the courage to open the locked door and share what was inside. And she thought of herself, of the privilege of being a link in this chain of remembrance. The wind moved through the pines outside, the same eternal sound. The lamp cast its familiar glow. The journal lay open, its pages now so numerous that it had become multiple volumes, each one adding to the record of lives remembered. Emma picked up her pen and began to write. "Dear friend," the letter started, "I heard about your loss, and I wanted you to know that you are not alone. Your mother's life mattered. She is remembered." And so the work continued, as it always had, as it always would. Letter by letter, life by life, memory by memory. One woman had locked a shed to protect her sacred work. Another had unlocked it to share that work with the world. And now countless others carried it forward, each one understanding that this was what it meant to be human, to see each other, to remember each other, to love each other through the simple, profound act of refusing to forget. The secret of the shed had been revealed, but it was a secret no longer. It was a practice, a mission, a movement. It was proof that one person, working quietly and without recognition, could change the world, not through grand gestures or dramatic acts, but through small, consistent, devoted attention to those who needed it most. Margaret Cole had understood this. Sarah Mitchell had honored it. Emma and her daughter would carry it forward. And somewhere, in every community where someone sat down to write a letter to a forgotten soul, the work lived on. The locked shed had become an open door, and through that door, love poured out into the world, one remembered life at a time. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.